Doug, you've just released a statement on what you think the essential principles of ESG should be. Everyone is worried about the environment, but nobody can agree on what these terms are. ESG. What are you actually proposing here today?
What we're proposing is a standardization of ESG disclosure, ESG funds. What we really look at is this theme about transparency and impact, that we should be providing a way that the market can have a set of standardized information that can be used to make decisions for investors. One of the things that I could say is that the train has already left the station. People are very interested in this. There's large value of funds that are out there, of people that are interested in investing based on purpose, based on value.
Yeah. So you've emphasized the essential elements of what's needed here. Transparency is one of them. A description of the impact on society and the environment, and the risk associated with things like climate change. This seems to be what they absolutely have to have here. Now, what do we do to advance this? Where do we go from here? How do we make this more real?
One of the best things we can do to advance this is to have a dialogue across the markets, both with investors as well with securities regulators, like we heard today from the SEC, as well as a way to have standardization around this on a global basis so that we're not seeing sort of a fragmentation. One of the risks we had before is there was a complete alphabet soup of different organizations trying to standardize ESG disclosure, and now there are a couple of different initiatives. The most important one is called the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, that is bringing together all these different groups to have one single approach to ESG disclosure.
I want to get into the ISSB and where we go from here, but I want to bring Todd in. First, Todd, congratulations on the new job. Just started ETF Trends, joining Tom Leighton's team over there. We've talked, you and I, many times that all of these ETFs employ different methodologies, and it's a problem. Spider S&P ESG is not quite the same as the iShares ESG. Has this confusion taken some of the luster off of ESG funds?
First of all, Bob, thanks for having me, and thanks for the kind words. Excited to be part of the ETF Trends and database family, connecting both asset managers, index providers with end clients. They do a great job, and I'm excited to be part of it. You're right. ESGU holds companies like Meta Platforms and Disney that you won't find with EFIV, that's the Spider S&P 500 ETF. There's different criteria that index providers use. There's different rules that go in for each of the respective ETFs. And we've got narrow-focused ETFs tied to governance, like the SHE ETF, the gender diversity, and clean energy ETFs like ICLN. So it's really hard for investors to keep up with what is inside and outside. So I applaud Doug and the broader investment community for trying to help standardize what's going on in the ESG.
Yeah, and those of you who don't understand what's going on, when we put up that the ESG ETFs, EFIV, Spider S&P ESG, that's State Street licensing your index. That's why it says S&P, right? I want to make people to understand what's going on here and how important the indexes are. State Street, which is SPDER here, is licensing your index at this point, right?
And what happened is what Todd just described is that there's so many different types of criteria being used today for ESG. Sometimes I describe it as like the healthy food movement. Healthy food movement could be somebody that's interested in organic, somebody else is interested in vegetarian, somebody is vegan, and you could go to a restaurant that's called vegetarian, but maybe they're serving fish. Is that the right thing? So we need to think about coming up with some standardization so that when you see that it's ESG or it's a no carbon or low carbon, what do those labels mean? How are we going to make sure that the data is clear to the end investor so that they know what they're investing in, and that the asset manager is also complying with what they put on their label?
Now, Todd, demand for ESG ETFs has slowed a bit to start 2022. Obviously, commodity ETFs, inflation ETFs are all the rage right now. But money is still coming in. It's just not as much as it was before, right?
That's right. So we've seen continued interest in ESG products, but to a different degree than we saw in 2020, for example. So ETF databases traffic for the 5 largest ESG ETFs is down roughly 40% year over year to start the year. So there's less focus on ESG, but there is people who are trying to understand what is climate change and how does it affect their portfolio. And we've seen a number of products that have come to market that have Paris aligned or climate change in the name. We're finding advisors and investors want to understand what makes it into the portfolio and why. And all the more education that can be provided, the better for investors to understand what they're getting and what they're not getting.
And You know, Doug, this is a rather fortuitous your announcement that you made today. For example, I think it's fortuitous because SEC Chair Gary Gensler, we've got some news today, has just released his long-awaited proposed rules on climate change, which would make disclosure mandatory, and he hopes more uniform in terms of what's being disclosed here. Is this a step in the right direction? How does this fit in with what you were talking about today?
We welcome this move because it opens up a dialogue between the business community, the investment community, and the regulatory community, something that we need to have so that we can work on what Todd just described as more standardization, more common approach to this area. One of the things Todd just also mentioned is climate change and the interest in that. And I think with the external circumstances going on right now with the war in Ukraine, that there's an increased interest in energy and energy transition and understanding what that means, what's the role of energy, what's the difference between oil versus clean oil versus natural gas, what's a transition type of an approach to the future of energy. It's going to be a lot of interest in that, and I think the interest is going to rise, and we're going to want to even have more standardization around what it means for investors.
Now, you publish the ESG criteria you use. I mean, you have your own criteria. You have the S&P Global ESG score methodology, right? It's on your website, in fact,
yes.
Right? Including the rationale and questions that you ask, the format, background information. How do you gather this data? Give us a sense of where this is actually coming from. Are the companies providing it? How many provide information? You know, how do you build this up from the ground up?
So today we take information from companies. We have 2,200 companies provide it to us through a very detailed, rigorous approach. They go onto our website. We have an approach with them, and they provide us detailed information. It literally takes hundreds of hours for them to complete. It takes a lot of time for them to complete it. Covers all of the aspects of E, S, and G. For other companies that are not providing us that kind of detailed information, we take it from their own websites. Companies have sustainability scores, they have sustainability reports. Some maybe there's a little bit in their 10K or their proxy. And then in many cases, we have to model it. We have to take industry standards and model what that data is. And this is one of the reasons why disclosure will be valuable, because then you're not having to model it. You're getting in a consistent way, and everybody can use it. One final point I want to make is that when you look at our scores, you're able to go not just at an aggregate score, you're also able to go down into details. If you just want to use the E part of the score, or the S part of the score, or the G part of the score, this has been another one of the criticisms of ESG scores. It kind of looks like an opaque score. You get one number or one letter, and what does that really mean? Right. We think that you need that granularity as well to really make informed decisions.
Yeah. Now, you describing the methodology, it sounds fairly rigorous. You don't have complete information, so you have to model some of it. But who is ultimately going to decide what the rules are going to be? Now, you mentioned the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. This is a new organization, right? Can you very briefly tell us what this is and why do you think they're the ones that are going to help pull everything together and bring order to this?
Well, ISSB is an organization that's been put together under what's called the IFRS, which is like the SASB at the global level, International Financial Standards Reporting Board. And they've now put in place underneath them the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board. This is also taking a convergence of other types of organizations like the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board and others, and bringing them all together in a single approach to have a global standards for disclosure. So the disclosure is a great start because it means that people like us that are going to come up with our ESG scores will have the exact same data. Right. So there's going to be different scores and different types of ratings, different types of opinions. But if we're all starting with the exact same data, that's going to be really valuable.
So just make it clear, in plain English, the ISSB is an organization composed of people like your organization that all have a stake in this, and you're all going to come to some common understanding. Are you a member of the
the ISSB is an organization that's run by governments.
Yeah. Okay. So I want to make sure that individuals are understanding how this is going to come to an agreement.
Well, the ISSB is a foundation.
Yeah.
And it's supported by governments and individual companies. It's funded through as if it was a foundation. And it has a board of directors, which include people from the public sector and the private sector. It has a relationship with the International Organization of Securities Commissioners.
And is the goal ultimately, here's the standards that we are going to use? Give us a sense of a timetable. When will an agreement be reached on this?
Yeah, their approach is to start actually having standards right away. There's some standards that people had already agreed on. I'll give you an example of about 21 simple standards that the World Economic Forum agreed, that there was a large group of corporations in the World Economic Forum agreed that this should be a standard that all companies should be able to provide. It's a very small number.
Yeah.
And they're going to start trying to come up with a small number of disclosures and start building from there. The approach is what I call build a baseline and then build from there. Get some simple things out there that people would start reporting and then build from there to get more consensus and more out into the market.
Todd, I've had an extended discussion here with Doug. I want to bring you back in. Does this make sense to you? You're a close observer of all this. Is the IASB the right way to approach this? And in your opinion, is this real progress towards getting some kind of agreement on ESG standards?
So I do think this is a step in the right direction, that there's a neutral observer that is helping to make sure that companies are providing the right disclosure. The SEC's role is going to play an important role. But I think it's also worth highlighting that even within the same index provider, they have different versions of ESG benchmarks that are narrowly constructed, that are broadly constructed, and there are ETFs that are tracking it that have S&P in the name or that have MSCI or other index providers, and they're going to perform differently because they're either broad or narrow in construction. So there's not going to be consistency. There are going to be different performance records for ESG ETFs, right, despite the fact that there's going to be some standardization of the underlying data.
Right. So this is very important that you can, Doug, you can have the same data and still come to different conclusions. You can also weight it differently, right? So environmental social governance, if you weight one part of environmental differently than other parts, you come up with a different index standard, a different weighting, right? It's important for people to understand that, right? What you're looking for is more standardization of
We're
data.
looking for standardization. I understand that later this week the SEC might also come out with a standard of kind of the naming conventions for ESG and sustainability funds, which truth in advertising, if you want to call it that, which means that people should be able to have the information that they will understand exactly what they're investing in, and that whoever is the ETF provider or fund provider will also be following the standards that they said they're going to follow.
Yeah. Well, this makes sense to me. I mean, I happen to think Gensler's right about this. He's been very critical of funds that say we're green or we're carbon neutral or we're whatever, and yet it's very fuzzy, the standards of what they're calling. This is that naming convention you were mentioning. Right. So that makes a lot of sense to me.
And it makes, and to what Todd was just saying, that there are different ETFs and there are different types of sustainability funds. As an example, over 20 years ago in S&P Dow Jones Indices, we launched the Dow Jones Sustainability Indices. They've been around for a long time, and the criteria that's used there is not the same that's used for the S&P 500 ESG index. Yeah,
it's certainly very different. So you think it's going to take how long? Is it actually going to be, will we see, pick a date, a year from now, the ISSB announcing international standards for ESG? Will it actually be a published saying this is what we are all agreed to?
I think that within a year from now we'll have a baseline which has started to be rolled out. It's going to start in Europe. Europe is ahead of us. The Europeans already have a taxonomy that they've started discussing. And you also have countries like Japan and in the UK that have also been mandating what's called the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, which is a report that had been put in place a few years ago. There's a group called the FSB, the Financial Stability Board in Europe, and Michael Bloomberg worked with them on this Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. In the United States, about 50% of the S&P 500 companies are already reporting on that. And that's now going to become mandated in some countries. So there's various approaches to climate or sustainability or ESG, but I think that the ISSB is going to take the TCFD, they're going to take other work that's been done, and they're going to incorporate it into this baseline that they're going to build from. And
let me ask you, just to get a response again, I know we asked you about Gensler before. I'm going to have him on Power Lunch in 1 hour from now, 2:15 on Monday. So I hope everybody tunes in for that. But what do you think corporate America is going to say about this? You know, there's this big thing about materiality. Gensler's insisting this is material information, and our job, one of the jobs of the SEC, is to protect investors. To protect investors, we need to have disclosure about this because it's materially important. And yet I see pushback already from people who are saying this is beyond the SEC's mandate at all. We had Hester Peirce, one of the commissioners of Republicans, say Congress did not give the SEC authority over the economy. She had a rather scathing dissent this morning and vote on this. What do you think? corporate America is going to say about this? You talk to corporate America. What are they saying?
Corporate America is going to be split on this. There's going to be a wide array of opinions. There are people that are already reporting this. As I mentioned, 50% of the companies are already doing a TCFD report. 90% of the S&P 500 companies already disclose some sort of an impact report or a sustainability report or a CR report. And they're already putting a lot of this information out there, maybe not in the same format that would be required here. But there's a couple of big reactions. One of them is going to be about the potential litigation, and they're going to have a safe harbor. Companies don't want to go out and disclose, in particular, Scope 3 emissions without having the ability to be protected from litigation against either making mistakes or it not being a clear standard, or people saying, well, I never knew that this was the total impact of your carbon footprint, and potentially having litigation. So there's going to be a whole discussion about safe harbor and litigation, and there's going to be another discussion about how expensive this is to comply with. And then there's going to be a set of companies that are going to say, well, I may be in a disfavored industry, and this could be difficult for me to comply with. There's going to be a wide array of opinions. But from my point of view, we welcome this debate. We think it's time to do it. As I said, the train has left the station. Yeah. This is what investors want.